Hey gang, Volty here. Today we're doing the second part of the Q&A, and that was my 100 sub special. Thank you very much to everyone who submitted a question and wanted to know more about my thoughts on 7-Point Highlander. Let's get right into it. There are some amazing questions that came through, and I've written out some detailed responses, so hopefully this will set up for the ability to do this again once we hit 500 subs. But let's get into it. First question from Armored Monkey 01. Hey Volty, are there any archetypes or cards you would like to see get more support in the future? I personally dream of the day that Cloudpost is a real build-around in Singleton. Thanks for all the great work with making the format more accessible to new players. Thank you very much for your question, Monkey. I've got a couple of images here, and these are some personal favorites. One, I 100% agree with Cloudpost. There are definitely not enough locusts, but at the same time, obviously, depending on what locust they print, we might see that card terrorize a couple of formats. Realistically, I don't think there's too much that we need here. The fact that we've had Thespian Stage printed to get us to 12 posts, and Vesuva and being able to replace some of the Glimmer posts, I think they're still playing 2, is a good start. It's a good move in the right direction, but at the same time, the card's really sweet, and obviously everyone likes casting Big or Drowsy. Next up is Elves. I think in the early days of Magic, Elves were definitely one of the best typal types that we had access to. Over time, both in 7-Point Highlander and in other formats, Elves have just been outclassed or taken over. We have things like goblins, we have things like humans, merfolk for instance, and personally I love casting elves. I'm a big fan of Gaia's Cradle, I'm a big fan of Priest of Titania, and I do think we need more elves that are printed that aren't just really mediocre lords. The last 5 years or so, most of the elves they've printed have just been 2-mana 1/1 lords, and that's not really what the elves type is meant to be doing. That's much more of a merfolk thing. Next up is Bitter Blossom representing fairies. I love fairies. I love Bitter Blossom, and I really think that having fairies be printed incidentally is not going to be enough to help the type. The fact that, you know, the first time that we introduced tribal, now typal, as a super type was in Lorwyn, where, you know, fairies were a really big deal. Was really cool, but at the same time, if we keep getting cards like Brazen Borrower, that is a fairy but has no synergy whatsoever, we're just not going to see Bitter Blossom see play, we're not going to see Fairy see play. Mistbind Click and Pepper Smoke are just wildly unplayable cards until we get a couple more. Next up is Valakut, and this is representing a couple of things. Valakut is kind of tied to Scapeshift and to Primeval Titan, and in a Singleton format, it's not possible to do something like that. And Titan Shift is a really cool deck, in my opinion. It's a very sturdy combo deck that has its weaknesses, it has its timer, but is very, very, very good in the matchups that it's good in, and pretty rubbish in the matchups that it's bad in, and I think that's where I would prefer combo decks to exist. The fact that you can have a combo deck nowadays in Modern that has the ability to disrupt you, has the ability to blow you up out of nowhere, and doesn't have, you know, a very particularly noticeable clock, is kind of, I don't know, it's a different take on design that WotC has done. I'm personally not a fan. I would much prefer the very slow, grindy combo deck that has the ability to blow you up if they can clear the way, but has meaningful points of interaction along the curve. Pop, Price of Progress, this is to represent Burn. I think that Burn has been bad in most of the formats that it's been legal in for quite a while. Price of Progress is one of the few draws to be able to play Burn in Highlander especially, because getting in for 2 or 3 damage every now and then just isn't cutting it. I think there's a few things they can do to make Burn more playable, or more printable, I guess. The fact that so many recent threats and so many recent cards in the last 5-10 years have so much incidental life gain on them, things like Flage and Uro, things like Sheoldred, a bunch of the removal spells. It's just getting a bit too much, and if we can get a cheaper Sulfuric Vortex, that might help. If we can get a second functional reprint of Price of Progress, so that you can play 2. There's a couple of different things they could do, and my Christmas list is definitely very different to what the Fire Design team is going to come up with. But personally, I think Burn is a really interesting deck because it fights on an axis that most people aren't prepared for. But when you are prepared for it, it's quite easy to beat, and so it's a very good thing for it to exist in the metagame as a metagame call. And at the moment, that's just not viable. Last is Grave Troll. This is obviously to represent Dredge, and I don't know, I'm personally a fan of Dredge. I know that that's going to be a very unpopular opinion. I think originally how they described Dredge to be, it was going to be a very cool mechanic. And I think the more cards they print with Dredge 2 and Dredge 3 on them, that are more castable and more usable, the better that Dredge can be. Having Golgari Grave Troll be essentially a Dredge 6, which is a draw 6, that you never plan on casting, is the worst end of design. But if you compare it to a card like Dark Blast is perfect. It's single black removal for small creatures, and if your opponent plays more small creatures, you can buy it back at the cost of filling your graveyard. And obviously you're going to have to put cards into your deck that work out of your graveyard in order to offset the Dredge mechanic. But that is the perfect design to me, in terms of what Dredge could have been. What it is now, very, very different, and the fact that they keep printing Incidental Graveyard Hate on playable cards is also making the mechanic really bad. But I think one day we could bring back Dredge in a Masters set. They just need to print Dredge 2 and Dredge 1 and Dredge 3 on playable cards that you plan on casting more often, and we can see the mechanic again. Next question is from Onion Girl 611. Not a very exciting question, but I was wondering about your personal watch list. Is the list ordered in any particular way? For example, by priority of which pointings you think should happen first, or on most reasonable changes? Are there pointings on the list you think are much more mandatory than others? Thanks for the question. Short answer, no. There was not a list of priority when I made the list that is on the website or in the previous video. However, there are pointings that I think are more relevant or more time sensitive than others, and so we'll go through these. I think 4th needs to go to 2 at some point. It is a priority pointing, and it's one of the cards that I pushed for the Foundations points update. I think it's one of the better reasons to be in red and white. And when I compare 4th Eolingus to 1-point cards, and then compare it to 2-point cards like Minsk and Boo, it certainly feels like a 2-point card to me. At the same time, red-white did get hit really hard, so it's possible that 4th won't be showing up, but the fact that it's very splashable in blue-white X decks does still leave me concerned. I think the card is very often going to be the only out that you have in a situation, and having a fireball at such an incredible rate is not something we've seen before. Next up is Nadu, 1-2. I will be up front. I think Nadu is at 1 point for its power level, and the second point that I want to add to it is not for its power level, but for its effect on game states. The fact that most Nadu combo turns with Nomads are non-deterministic, and it is relatively likely that you won't win the game depending on your resources before the Nadu turn, but that your opponent's win percentage goes down very close to 0, but not quite 0. It's a very feel-bads moment. I think the fact that you're either encouraging players to concede early for time, which is not something you ever really want to do, or you're encouraging them to fight out a 0.5% win game on the off chance they go runner, runner, runner. It's just not viable. And the second point would be added specifically for that play experience, but not necessarily for its power. Spellseeker, 1-2. I think Time Walk going to 6 is fine, and I would personally be perfectly fine with that. However, by pointing Spellseeker instead, you're effectively pointing the Walks deck to their full 7, while at the same time doing incidental splash damage to Thoracle, which I think is actually in a really well-placed position right now. The fact that Spellseeker and Thassa's Oracle go well together so cleanly, but Thassa's Oracle going to 5 seems a bit egregious to me. I'm not utterly convinced that putting Thassa's Oracle to 5 and Time Walk to 6 is a cleaner change than putting Spellseeker to 2. Now, in saying that, a 3-mana 1/1 that draws a card ostensibly is not a 2-point card, and it is very much a symptom of everything else around it, but things like Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor are all at high point values as well, and I think this would just be more of that. Last up in the priority pointings is Demonic Council to 1. I think the card is closer to a 1-point tutor than a lot of the 1-point tutors that we have, like Wishclaw Talisman and Profane Tutor and ET. I think it's better than all of those cards. I don't think it's half of a power level of Demonic Tutor, but I do think it is more powerful than the other 1-point tutors that we currently have, and I think realistically we've been watchlisting it and keeping an eye on it to see what it can do. But we already know what Demonic Tutor can do, and we know what tutors can do in general in terms of combo decks, so I think this is a relatively safe pointing. For D pointings, I have Gifts at 0. I think the card's really sweet and it sees absolutely 0 play. If you're looking for a 1-point card that wins the game on the spot by putting cards in your graveyard, Intuition will do it better, because it's 1 mana less. Gifts Ungiven is just, it's outclassed by Intuition like 9 times out of 10, but I think there are sweet gifts piles that people could be playing, and at the same time, a 4 mana instant speed spell that doesn't win the game by itself, it's pretty bad, and I think having Gifts at 0 could open up the door for some cool things. One of the things that interests me about the card is that you really do need to build around your Gifts pile in order for it to actually win the game. And if you have a Gifts pile in mind, your opponent has a decent amount of graveyard hate available to them, Gifts is no different to Intuition. However, it does allow you to pick up 4 removal spells, for example, and you can choose the 2 out of them that your opponent gives you and then use them to clear the way for your combo. And getting 2 out of 4 is much more interesting than 1 out of 3 when it comes to that game plan. Again, it's a 4 mana spell. I think it could go to 0. There's a reasonable chance it'll break and there'll be a deck that's really, really good, but I think that's unlikely. Enlightened Tutor to 0. The card is frankly terrible. If you're spending a point on Enlightened Tutor, that's really bad, and I think it is entirely possible that if you put ET in your deck at 0, it's still bad. Obviously, there are some cards that do win the game on the spot, like Underworld Breach, that you can ET for and fast bond, but it's still card disadvantage. It's still a really bad top deck, and at the moment, everyone who's spending a point on ET is spewing a lot of equity, and I fully expect that people will play ET at 0, realize it's bad, and then it'll go back to seeing niche play. Wishclaw Talisman, card is horrific. I think it is much, much worse than Demonic Council. I think it's probably a decent bit worse than Profane Tutor, but there's a little bit there. A lot of the combos you can do with Wishclaw Talisman in order to offset its downside are not meaningful, and for the most part the card is Grim Tutor, which is 1 black, search for a card, take a bunch of damage, and Wishclaw Talisman is just not a playable card. It hasn't seen any play at 1, and I fully expect that to stay relatively the same. Last is Recall 5 to 4. I like it when people play Recall. I think it's a really iconic Magic card. I think it's a really sweet Magic card, and at the moment no one's playing it. I don't expect it to break the format. I don't expect anyone to want to fork out 10 grand for a Recall in order to play it in Highlander. I don't think anyone will feel priced in to buying it because there's suddenly a best deck that has recall in it. I think it'll just take a little bit of the pressure off from people who want to play their recall. And if we change Lutri, for example, it'll be substantially worse. So at the very least, I think it would open up a couple of different creative opportunities for people. And having recall in the format when we have things like Orcish Bowmasters and Sheoldred and Mental Misstep, there's a lot of hate for it. And it's substantially worse to rebuy over and over again than Time Walk, which is why, all of these are factors of why it's seeing absolutely zero play at 5. And I want to bring it back. Card's really cool. Onion Girl also had a second question. I would also love to know what you think we could do to encourage more people playing Highlander. I recognize that you've put hours and hours and hours into trying to do this yourself, and believe your resources are invaluable and great, and have noticed a large surge in more Highlander players in the last year or so. But that being said, what behaviors from consistent players would you like to see to help grow the community? Other things you think stores could do to help? How would you go about pitching 7-point to Commander players? Is it worth doing for newer players that might seem to enjoy 1v1 semi-competitive Magic, even if they're from the completely different world of Commander? So when I said Onion Girl asked a second question, this is actually 6 or so, but I really do appreciate it, and we'll go through them one at a time. So in terms of behaviors from consistent players, I think making sure that at the LGS level, when you have weekly events, that people are engaging with newer players and making sure that they feel welcomed into the community, asking them about their deck and making sure you provide meaningful advice that isn't just, go buy a volcanic island. In terms of behaviors, it's really small things. I think one of the bigger parts that the players themselves could be doing is being more engaging and a little, I guess, less ingrained and less toxic, for lack of a better term, on the Discord server. There are definitely a lot of people who are joining the 7-point Discord and are lurking, and they see a lot of the comment threads that occur in some of the bigger channels and are put off by it. I know that I've received feedback from players who are a bit concerned or a bit scared of the Discord in that sense. And the fact that it's one of the more, encompassing areas for the format and for players across the country, having that space be more welcoming and be more safe would be an ideal change. In terms of what stores could do, realistically, the stores who are running weeklies are already doing what they should be doing. It's possible that if they can build a deck that they can lend out that's relatively cheap and doesn't have any cards that are worth stealing, for example, to lend out to people who want to play the format and give it a try, that's one of the easier steps. However, obviously there are logistics issues with that. Holding more events, holding more smaller events on Saturdays and Sundays, even though you'd be running at a loss, that's what stores could be doing. I think most of the stores in the country that care about 7-point Highlander are already doing what they need to be doing, and it's just a matter of giving it some time. In terms of pitching 7-point to Commander players, I think it really only works if you target the CDH community. Commander as a format is just dramatically different from Highlander, where the goal is to have a shared experience with 3 other people where you all enjoy yourselves and spend a large amount of time. CDH being much more cutthroat and more interactive, with very specific rules of engagement in terms of free interaction and infinite combos and ways to blow people up with Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation, for example. That section of the community is far more likely to be interested in playing 7-point. Long term, there are videos that I have planned for, here's what a 7-point deck looks like, here's the cards that you would have from playing CDH, but realistically, just engaging with the CDH players on their terms and suggesting or providing information or directing to impactful, content and videos and articles is probably the most you can do. Realistically, the CDH players who would want to play Highlander already know about its existence and will probably come over when they're ready or when they can. From CatGamer9, I noticed in the RL cards to avoid using in the 8 points deck video, you mentioned a few decks were not working as expected and went to the cutting room floor. I was wondering how many deck tech videos for Highlander you're planning to make per month. I wonder if you could do a video further explaining the good deck designs that sadly went to the cutting room floor. I'm asking this question because I had a few ideas for decks for Highlander that ended up getting to the cutting room floor. Keep up the good work. Thanks, Kat. I'm not going to do... Realistically, I can't do a video explaining all of the decks that fall through, just because there's thousands of them and it would be very difficult. However, I do have some notable RL cards, and in the next slide, and we'll talk about those in a minute. In terms of deck tech videos, I think at the moment I'm trying to do about one a week, but because there are so many events and so much movement happening at the moment, especially with the Fight Night series, it's probably going to be dialed down to about two, especially for the budget series because they're really hard to make. It's hard to come up with an idea that makes sense, that actually is possible within the $75 budget. But in terms of decks that don't work in the 8-point space, for the most part, it's not, oh, this card is on the RL, I can't actually make this deck, it doesn't work. It's more, this card is RL and I don't have access to it and I know my deck is going to be worse for it. What's the point of making a subpar version at 8 points when there are so many 8-point decks that are intact and whole? So for example, Cradle decks, there's no real point in playing Natural Order Craterhoof or a bunch of Llanowar Elves when you don't have Cradle, and so very few of the 8-point decks that I've been building have been, 8-point mana dork decks, because it's just not viable. Recurring Nightmare, a lot of the reanimation effects that are single use, like Reanimate, Animate Dead, a bunch of them are not on the reserve list, so they're usable, so you can build a reanimated deck, but that's not what Nightmare does. Recurring Nightmare is a very grindy, value-based card, where you keep feeding creatures into Nightmare, you cast it a bunch of times, and you generate enough value to run your opponent over. And because Recurring Nightmare is on the reserve list, I just haven't been able to do it. Raphelos is tied to Cradle, but not quite. Raphelos is a very particular creature in terms of what it powers you up to do. You can actually put in a bunch of forests, and if your Raphelos gets to untap, you can make a bunch of mana without Cradle, and without a large number of creatures in play, notably. Raphelos off Forest into Third Forest gives you 6 mana on 3, but because he's on the RL, a lot of those strategies have fallen off as well. Academy is here to represent bots. Basically, every single time I've tried to build 8-point Affinity, it's just been worse because it doesn't have Academy. And Workshop obviously has its power as well, but Academy being able to work with things like Signal Pest and Arcbound Ravager, where Workshop is more tailored towards Metalworker, there really isn't much of a reason to be building bots at 8 points. The extra points you get don't actually do anything, and losing the most impactful land is kind of sad, and so I've dropped that project a couple of times. Moat is here to represent Enchantress decks and Prison decks. A lot of the RL enchantments are very critical to a lot of the Prison decks that you could be building surrounding enchantments. Moat is obviously one, but there's also things like Nether Void and Humility and Chains of Mephistopheles and the Abyss, and all of a sudden you just don't have a lot of the most impactful enchantments possible. So even though cards like ET and Idyllic Tutor are legal and not on the reserve list, I've given up on building Enchantress and a couple of the other Prison decks because of that. Lastly is Gush. Gush is not on the reserve list, but it's more representative of a type of deck that I've tried to make work in 8 points, but haven't really been able to, which is really aggressive tempo decks. So when you have Gush and you have a Volcanic Island and a Steam Vents and an island in your mana base, it is much more viable to cast Gush and Daze, picking up your dual land. When you're playing 8 points and your mana base is a shock land, a surveil land, and a basic, unless you're playing quite a large amount of islands, things like Gush and Daze are just really, really hard to justify casting. Because if you Gush and pick up, 2 shock lands because you're in 3 colors, or a shock land and a surveil land, or a surveil land and a basic, you're just going to be taking a lot of damage and falling behind on the tempo. And because of how Gush is designed and how those decks are designed, you really can't afford to fall back for a reason as silly, I guess, as having an 8th point. And so I've stopped building Gush and Daze decks and, Monastery of Swiftspear Prowess decks because it's just not viable when Steam Vents is your best land. From W. Lamarca 11, this is a doozy and we'll go through this all together. Thank you very much, Will, for the questions. So I have one broad question about 7 point that I'd love to hear you respond to in detail. How would you personally like to see the points list managed in the medium to long term? In answering that question, I'd love to hear you touch on the following. What I'm going to do for these is read out the 5 questions, and then we'll go through them in a general essay form. So, part 1, if Wizards continues to power creep sets, particularly Modern Horizons sets, should the committee respond by increasing the rate of pointings or by depointing older combo cards to power up the format, given it's likely that Wizards prints more Broadside Bombardiers but not more Doomsdays, or a balance, so a third option. Actually, what I'll do is I'll address the general question and then refer back to it as we go through each of these, because otherwise this will be really long. In terms of how the points list should be managed in the medium to long term, I don't know that we necessarily need a massive restructure in the points list. That's not quite how 7 point works. These massive changes, there's a lot of ripple-on effects, and because people have sunk tens of thousands of dollars in, you don't really want to have these really big changes occur. Instead, over time, the design philosophy is going to impact the pointing philosophy, and in terms of how I want to approach it, pointing the format and keeping the format fresh and keeping it updated while maintaining a relatively stable power creep, that's something that we can manage. So depointing older combo cards to power up the format really has a negative flow-on effect where you'll either depoint certain combo cards and decks to a point where they're simply the best thing to be doing and they won't print any new cards for it, but it'll just be a structured deck that exists in the format, and maybe that's fine and maybe it's not. Or you can keep increasing the rate of pointings as the new cards come out and simply pick and choose the best cards out of each of the supplemental sets and the commander sets and make sure that nothing too broken falls through. Every now and then there's going to be a card that has become outclassed over time, and it would be fine to depoint even if it does speed up a lot of the combo decks purely because of how low impact it is. I think Imperial Seal is probably the perfect example of this. At 2 points, it's unplayable, and at 1 point, it's still card disadvantage, it's still life loss, it's still very much face up what you're trying to do. And so cards like that are probably able to be depointed, where cards like Lotus, for example, have to stay at their current point values just because a lot of the combo decks that it would enable would simply become too self-contained and too powerful, if that makes sense. So a balance is definitely what I would be aiming for. Increasing the rate of pointings is fine as long as they're very targeted. So it's not that we're pointing the best card printed in every new set. or the best 2 cards or the best 3 cards. It's more, we want to see the impact of cards as they come out, and then make sure that the format gets stabilized and we don't have anything running away. Do you think it's more important that each card is at a points level where it has a potential to see play, or that the play experience remains fun? Obviously, fun is subjective. Would you support depointing powerful cards that don't see much play, such as Recall, Vault, or Channel, even if it meant the possibility that decision would need to be reversed? How much risk should the committee be prepared to take for depointings? This is a really interesting question. Personally, the mission statement says that each card and each archetype and each, we want to encourage deck diversity and card diversity. And so for me personally, I want every card on the points list to have some amount of viability. I know that this is an unpopular opinion, both among current committee members and past committee members and community members, but every card should have a reasonable chance at seeing play, based off the power level that it's at compared to the points level that it's at. So for me personally, depointing Recall, depointing Time Vault, both of those are reasonably fine, given that they're not seeing play at their current points value and they do have natural insurance in the format. In terms of the risk that the committee should be prepared to take, I'm more than willing to take higher risks when it comes to depointings if I believe that the format will be better off as a result of those depointings, and I'm also more than willing and more than ready to be wrong about those things. So when I made the strip mine depointing, I thought it would be better for the format. We would see a little bit more of the card, but it wouldn't quite be, as egregious or as popular when it got depointed. And I was right about that, but when it came to the statement that we made about strip mine, I made it very clear that we were ready to reverse it if need be. So if we got it wrong, we would simply put it back up to 2 and just say, that's our fault. Sorry for the format being a little bit wonky for 6 months. In terms of the risk, I'm more willing to take more risks, because I think that changing the format and focusing on format health and trying to get it right is a loftier goal, but a more meaningful goal than being really careful about it and having changes that should be made just not get made over time. I think WotC has the perfect example of this, where Golgari Grave Troll was banned, then it was not banned, then it was banned, then I think it's still banned, or it's not banned at the moment. And being willing to make that call in either direction shows a lot of faith, I guess. 7-point is a massive format. Every single card that gets printed moves into the format, and we're going to get it wrong sometimes. There's a lot of manual upkeep in terms of maintaining the format, so I'm more than willing to continue making changes, even if they do need to get reversed, although I would much prefer to make a change that I believe doesn't need to be reversed rather than just shaking up the format. Do you think the current rate that cards are pointed at is reasonable, or would you like to see cards pointed earlier, or conversely given more time at 0 for players to fit them in their decks for free? For example, cards like Psychic Frog and Flage that were watch listed before being pointed. Should fair cards ever be pointed on release? I think the current rate that we're pointing cards is fine. I would personally prefer to depoint some stuff and point some stuff after we have... I would prefer cards to get extra points or their first point after we've seen what they can do. I'm very much not willing to just point a card based off what it looks like, because that doesn't have any data backing it. That's kind of just a gut feeling. In terms of depointing, I'm more than happy to depoint cards without substantial data on them, because presumably if we're trying to depoint them, they probably don't have data on them. But in terms of pointing cards, I think I would prefer them to do something and impact the format in some way before receiving their point, just in case we're wrong. and we point a card that doesn't actually need a point, because I think that's a worse result than having a card be at 0 for a little bit too long and then point it afterwards. I don't really want to point any cards on release, let alone just fair cards. I think realistically there are going to be very, very few instances where we see a card that has a complete known precedent. Like, obviously, if they print Ancestral Recall number 2 or Treasure Cruise number 2 and it's a functional reprint, that will get pointed on release, but I just don't think that's going to happen. And I think as we see new cards, we can evaluate them during spoiler season, we can keep an eye on them, but I do want to let them into the format and see what they actually do. Do you think any radical changes to the points list are necessary or forthcoming? Not in terms of specific cards, but larger changes in the sense of the accessibility rule, giving an eighth point to non-RL decks. Do you have any big picture ideas that could be worth community discussion? That's a great question. I personally don't know that there are any radical changes that are needed at the moment. The points list is something that is constantly changing, and the fact that we get new committee members and new blood with new takes on how we approach the points list and how we approach the format does have a self-insulating factor. So, we don't get stuck into really stagnant points list philosophies over time, just because the format changes, the metagame changes, the community grows, and the committee changes. However, in terms of big picture ideas, I do have a bunch from before I joined the committee. I've talked about some of them with the committee members, and there are some other background big picture things that may or may not be useful. For the most part, they aren't related to pointing specifically or pointing philosophies, but they're usually logistics ideas, changing how cards get viewed on the watch list, having some kind of community input, for example. I'm not entirely sure if any of them are worthy of community discussion. I think I would need to be on the committee for longer in order to determine whether or not they're worth talking about. But at the moment, in terms of answering this question, no. I think the points list is fine. I think the fact that we have new people looking at the points list with new points philosophies and the format has been stabilizing relatively well, that I think it's fine. Any other aspects to managing the points list format in the long term that aren't covered above? No, not really. I would like there to be a bit more transparency, and that's something that I will work on in my own time in terms of providing that transparency. For example, I have my personal watch list, which is not something that's existed before. I think having a committee watch list that is very public facing on the website is good. However, because of the nature of the watch list and the points changes, the watch list has to be very careful and very particular, which doesn't lead to giving as much information as it could. So I personally have my points watch list visible at all times, because I think that encourages people to engage with me and engage with that watch list to determine, what I think of the format, what changes I would be presenting at each meeting, and what I want the format to look like. And that way, if you disagree or if you agree, you can engage with me in that sense. I think that's realistically one of the first steps in order to managing the points list in my fashion. But I don't have anything else that I can really talk about. I'll have a chat with the committee members over time as I solidify some stuff, but it's fine for now, and in the long term I think there are changes that I'll put forward, but they do need to be cooked for a bit longer. I also have one question about Magic in general. What do you think about the state of the game, specifically with regards to power creep and Universes Beyond now being half of all Magic sets? Power creep is inevitable. That happens with any card game. and with anything that has set releases and product that they need to sell, I think the rate that we have power creep has actually gone down a little, with the exception of the Modern Horizon sets, which are notorious for having very substantial power creep. But in terms of cards that we've seen in standard legal sets making it to older formats, we've seen less and less over time. They've learned from some of their mistakes, and while standard as a whole might be becoming a little more powerful, we've seen, fewer Deathrite Shamans and fewer Delver of Secrets than we used to, mainly because they're getting contained within the supplemental sets. In terms of UB, realistically, the fact that the Universes Beyond sets are going to be standard legal should protect us from massive amounts of power creep, because you can't print broken cards into standard anywhere near as much as you can into modern. So I think that will be self-correcting and hopefully shouldn't be too much of an issue. Thanks everyone. Thank you so much to the people who submitted questions. I hope that this provided a bit of insight into where I'm at, or what my thoughts are on the format at the moment. If you want to keep track of what I'm thinking about the format at any time, there is a blog on my website, volti.online, but otherwise, I'll see you guys at the 500 sub mark. This video was brought to you with the support of my patrons and donors. I really do appreciate that a lot of these people have been sticking it out since day one, and as the channel grows and as we reach more people, it means a lot. If you would like to support me financially, there will be links down below, as well as on the website, to the Patreon and the Ko-Fi. But otherwise, if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything and it helps me out a lot. I'm trying to grow my channel outreach, and obviously trying to grow my channel in that sense. But otherwise, I'll catch you all next time.